today, and this one is talking about Maroon Genealogy. So if you are a Maroon, or if you are a Maroon Genealogy enthusiast, then this is definitely a presentation you will want to tune into. Dr. Regis, give me a thumbs up, please. I know it's late in Edinburgh. Thank you so much. Yes, yes. Okay, we made it, everybody, to the last presentation. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Dr. Osborne. I am an anthropologist by training. I'm a biocultural medical anthropologist. I am also a research lead within the tech industry, and I am an ambassador for DNA Tested Africans for Caribbean and Cultural Affairs. It moves across the African continent. Our founder has tested over 250 African rulers, traditional organizers, community organizers, leaders, and those of us within the diaspora who have matched them with our ancestry. Our organization facilitates those reconnections. So my father has confirmed DNA relatives from Erie Kingdom as well as the Kingdom of Abagana. And what you see there is him and my mother pictured with one of our Igbo royal relatives who traveled with their delegation to the Nanny Day Festival in 2024. So I'm a Maroon genealogist. I think I can say that. And so I'm so excited to share with you all my presentation that focuses on tracing names, tracing roots, digital tools for Maroon genealogy. The brief overview, I think a lot of these things have already been captured by some of our historians and academic scholars who have been on the call. They talked a lot about Maroon origin, some of those linguistic types of influences and the shapings of Jamaica's various pidgin languages, or pidgin tongues that shifted into those creolized languages. So I'll touch on that very briefly, and then I'll talk about some of those naming conventions among Maroons and how that evolved over time. And then I'll spend the rest of my presentation really going over some of those digital tools and platforms that we can use to explore our genealogy as Maroons and Maroon descendants. So before I get started, I definitely want to pay homage, since we are talking about genealogy, bloodline, lineage, to my own. So for those of you all that do not know, my father is from the Upper Rio Grande Valley, the one with the white beard. We call him Silver Fox down there, the mighty Millbank Maroon. He descends from both the Osborne family in Moortown, as well as the Bernard clan of Comfort Castle and Millbank. And my grandparents that you see there, they are late, but as we know, with Maroons, our ancestors never leave us. So I wanted to definitely pay homage and respect to my direct ancestors that made it possible for me to be here today.
So, looking at Maroon origins, we know that much of the scholarship written about Maroons relegates our presence on the island to just the time when the British occupied the island or practiced enslavement and colonialism. However, our Maroon ancestors have been on the island long before the British invaded it, with the first people to practice marronage on the island actually being our Taino ancestors. Then we would have the early African arrivals, the first Africans who came to the island and contributed to early Maroon ethnogenesis. They actually came directly from the Iberian Peninsula or modern day Spain and Portugal. However, the Spanish would begin to bring additional Africans directly from West and Central Africa. And this would include the bringing of people from the Upper Guinea and Senegambian regions, including the Mandinka, as well as the Wolof, for example. This expansion of slavery under the Spanish would also see a shift from enslaving the Taino to begin to focus exclusively on enslaving Africans. And during this era of expansion, we would begin to see the Akan, or including specifically the Ashanti and Fanti from the Gold Coast region or modern day Ghana, being forcefully brought to the island, as well as Africans from the Congo as well as the Angola region. All of this occurred during the Spanish period, way before any British ever set foot on the island of Jamaica.
As the Spanish began to wane in their power and their presence on the island, we still continue to see Africans continue to escape into the mountainous interior and intermingle and continue to forge those communities with Taino survivors. All of that took place prior to the British being here. So it's important to really emphasize that the Maroons or their ancestors had a very prominent presence and ubiquitous one on the island prior to any British setting foot upon the island. However, during that early British period, we would continue to have a proliferation of various African people across the continent that were being imported into the island, primarily again from the Gold Coast, from various bites, the bites of Biafra, which we have the Igbo. For those of you all that do not know, after Virginia, Jamaica is the second largest destination for where Igbos were imported during the transatlantic slave trade. This is why we get certain words like unu, which means you, or okoro, which is the Igbo word for okra. All of these are loan words that we get from the Igbo language. And then we have the bites of Benin, where we get the Yoruba and the Ewe, who we may call Papa people, or the Papa tribe. And then we continue to have the Congo and Angola, as well as the Malagasy people. All of these various people contributed to that Maroon, those various Maroon societies. So I wanted to definitely give you guys that we were, in our very inception, a heterogeneous people with that initial foundation being among those Taino people and those various Africans that would join them in the mountainous interior. And so what does that mean for those linguistic or cultural influences? As I said before, these were various people, and with them they brought various languages. I am not a linguistic anthropologist. We have linguistic experts who have already talked to us. The only thing I will call out here is that we had, during these various periods, these different individuals trying their best to communicate with each other. How did that work? For example, during the slavery expansion period, we would have this emergence of a pidgin contact language. We talk about pidgin and we talk about Creole. The pidgins, where we have people that come from very different places that have very different languages, and they're interacting with each other for the very first time. This is where a pidgin dialect will emerge. However, over time, like for example, during that late Spanish period and that early British period, we will begin to have this maturation of a creolized language. We have the Jamaican patois language as well as Cromanti. And Cromanti was forged even during that late Spanish period, with the early British period actually having very little English contribution to that Cromanti tongue. We do have another language that we know is spoken among our Maroon people during ceremony, the spirit language or the deep language. We're not talking about that particular language within this presentation, but I do want to acknowledge that that also does exist, which is very similar in some ways to the language that's spoken among the Suriname Maroons, as well as among the Creole, who are, some of them are Jamaican Maroon descendants in Sierra Leone. Looking at the linguistic and cultural layers, it's important to emphasize that through daily life, through resistance, all of these various diverse tongues would merge in some form of fashion in varying degrees, with the Akan language taking prominent or dominance in some ways within the way our early Maroon ancestors communicated. However, as we've heard from the linguistic experts that's presented to us before, there were various other contributions that contribute to Cromanti, and Cromanti, as we hear it today and speak it today, in a lot of ways, is the tweet of 400 years ago. So we do see some of these various different languages or remnants of these languages, retentions of these languages that are evident in our early Maroon names that I'll talk about now. I conducted a structural analysis on the early settlement records of our people. And those early settlement records, this is those records that took place after the wars, where they were settling in our various communities that we already know from when Elder Bernard spoke about the various communities that we have. And so from that, it seems like the British did a very good job of being obsessed about our movements after the wars. And these records are a testament to that, I suppose. And based upon that, what we saw from that structural analysis that we cross-referenced with various databases as well as AI-powered tools as well, we see that English as well as Irish and Scottish, so these European surnames are very prominent among these early settlement Maroons. We're not surprised by that from the early conversations that we've had. However, those retentions do exist. We do see roughly around 11% of those names being Akan names, so those day names. Our ancestors still maintained that despite having that exposure and that intermingling with those Europeans who were either colonizers, or we may have very well have had intermarrying with them as well. In addition to the Akan, we had other African and Central African retentions as well as during that Spanish period from Mediterranean and North African names as well as a subset or a trace of those names being indigenous or Caribbean in etymological origin. So some of those names, to give you guys some examples of what we saw on the early settlement records. So we have the English names, such as Ellis, Paris, Osborne, Rowe, White. We know that these are some very prominent or common families within Moortown and other Maroon communities. Also, the Irish and Scottish surnames such as Douglas, Sterling, Mackenzie, Curry. These are all surnames that we saw emerging on those early settlement records. However, we also do continue to see those day names, such as Cujo, Quaco, or those regular Akan names, Nanny. It's interesting to note, we know we have but one Queen Nanny or Granny Nanny. However, during those early settlement records, we had many women in Moortown who bore the name of Nanny. So it's important to emphasize that as well as Kwashi, Kwashiba, and Kufi. Other West or Central African names we have such as Juba and Afi. Afi may be a derivative of Afi from the Ewe people. And then we also have indigenous Caribbeans such as Cuba or Wanaka. Now about Cuba, we've seen in some of the etymological databases that they may classify this as a derivative of an Akan day name, but we also see when it's spelled explicitly as Cuba or another derivative of that, they would classify it as potentially an indigenous Caribbean origin, as well as Wanaka. We know Wanaka is a region in present-day Suriname as well. And then we have, again, those Mediterranean North African contributions and those creolized or mixed origins. So they may have multiple European origins or an origin of like African as well as Mediterranean or a mix thereof. It's also important to note that the name Osborne, and I'll talk about that in the next slide more, even though we classify it as English, one of the earliest Osbornes whose name one of the early Maroons actually adopted was actually of Scottish origin. So there was a very, very strong adoption of Irish and Scottish surnames among Maroon people in the early settlement period. I do think it's important to pause and talk about why this happened. So we know that we had these single African names. Prior to British occupation, we had African names, we had non-European traditional names. However, over time, there was this shift or this migration from those traditional single names without surnames to having a European first and European last name. Why is that? One of the reasons for that is in the early 1700s, even though many of our Maroon ancestors bore those African day names, we saw a trend or a pattern that emerged among those initial Maroon leaders that would sometimes adopt a European name to solidify their free status or their social standing within the broader society. So this initially began in a lot of ways with those early Maroon leaders. However, we saw from various records that the elders would continue on carrying those African single names well into the 1790s. This is almost 50 years, a half a century after the Second Maroon War. However, around 1800, we see this emergence of Christianity, and this conversion, again, the Maroon communities were not immune to that. So we saw a lot of conversions taking place within our communities, and this also led to a gradual decline of those single African names to adopting a Christian first name or forename and a European last name. And on top of that, one of the other, I think, more unfortunate aspects of this is that we saw this Christian conversion, but then also in tandem, in line with that, we saw this rise of associating our traditional names with derogatory attributes. So, for example, Kwashi, which is a day name, now becomes associated with someone who's foolish, who's dirty, who's low class. The same as Kwashiba, considered now to be a mule or a promiscuous woman, or prostitute. These are very sad but realistic things that our ancestors had to navigate when they were trying to also continue on to forge their identity in a ever-changing and homogenous and oppressive environment within the broader island. And so an example that I give here, a case study from our own Osborne family, excuse me, is from King Osborne. He was the colonel of the Maroons. He lived to be 103 years old, and he is the first Maroon that I have seen in the early settlement records to bear the name Osborne. However, it's important to note that he's not the first person on the island to be called King Osborne. So there was in the between 1756 1820 a man that lived who was of Scottish descent named King Osborne. He was the Speaker of the Jamaican Assembly at that time, as well as an attorney who did marry into a sugar plantation family. This is the name that particular Osborne Maroon ancestor adopted for, again, some of those various reasons that I just stated. I want to talk a little bit for the remainder of the time around those digital tools. So I'm going to share with you all or highlight just 5 for today. And the first one that I will talk about is looking at Ancestry. So Ancestry.com, I know we talk a lot about DNA testing. There's a lot of fear and mistrust around DNA testing, so I won't even begin to touch on that for this presentation. I will focus exclusively on their genealogy tools because they do have a lot of robust tooling outside of the actual DNA testing. So with that, one of the things that's very interesting here is that Ancestry can allow people from all over the world, including indigenous communities, to build out family trees. And if we so desire, to actually, those that want to DNA test, to connect those DNA matches to that tree in a way that it can even predict future or predict common ancestors that you may share. So I'm giving an example here from Chief Colonel King Osborne, who was my 4-time great-grandfather. I was able to use their genealogy records to pull up additional information about him, but I was also able to search their trees and look up people that I have in common who I'm related to find common ancestors, not only for him, but for other people. And during those DNA match searches that I do, I actually found a cousin in Sierra Leone among the Creole people who is a descendant of the Jamaican Maroons who were taken from the island. So this is very powerful. I think it's important for us to reiterate, even though we know we have our Maroon story, has its ethnogenesis in the island, our story continues. We have multiple chapters across the globe wherever Maroons have migrated either voluntarily or by force. And so that's an example or a testament to our Maroon ancestor there, as well as our Sierra Leonean Maroon family who we have connected with. Family Search is another tool that people can use. They provide global resources as well for people to leverage. And I think it's important to note that we talk a lot about those Christian conversions that took place around the island, including within the community. But we do also have, there's some value to that historical period because we do have church records or church census records that we unfortunately can use to be able to authenticate and trace our Maroon lineage. And Family Search has a very robust repository of those archival records. And so what you see here is I'm actually searching on their website, typing in the first and last name of King Osborne, his location where he was in Moortown, the estimated year he was born, 1742, and I'm able to pull up the burial records or that death index to actually have him listed where it shows that he was King Osborne, Colonel of the Maroons, who lived to be over 100. And fun fact, we had a lot of people that lived to be well into their 80s, 90s, and even centennials in those records. My Heritage is another one. They do also provide genealogy records as well. But one thing that I wanted to just call out for them is that they also do, in this era of AI, provide a lot of photo restoration and image editing software as well. So this image that you see here on the left is of Moortown in 1888. It's a black and white photo. However, with just a few clicks, I was able to enhance and colorize that image of of our community into now a colored image. And so you can do other things too. You can also repair images that you may have of your late ancestors. If the image was cracked or creased, it can repair that. Also, it can animate it. I'm personally kind of scared about animating my grandma, but you can do that if that's your thing. You can actually even, again, enhance it through colorization and things like that. In this era of AI, there's a lot of different capabilities that you can do. Now, also, the government archives is another area that I think is just worth highlighting here. So, as I mentioned before, the Maroon story is very much a global one. We've had, from the time of the Maroon Wars, Maroons, by one reason or another, leaving the island. So, for those that say if you're not born in the community, you're not a Maroon, tell that to my cousin in Sierra Leone. Tell that to the Maroons who had to leave during the Windrush movement. Tell that to the Maroons who had to actually slave and labor in the Panama Canal. Tell that to the Maroons who had to leave on work visas to actually slave and sugarcane plantations in the American South and Florida. So it's very important to note that the Maroons are a very global people. We can definitely say we are a diaspora people the same way other people have diasporas. And we are much stronger if we acknowledge our diaspora. So within this example here, I am showing examples of the passenger list from Louisiana, because guess what? We had Maroons that moved to Louisiana in the 1940s, as well as the Carolinas. These people still exist today, and the records are a testament to that. And last but not least, something that I am working on right now, because I realize that all of these various websites and platforms have varying levels of different types of records for Maroon people. However, it's not a centralized or digitized repository built by Maroons for Maroons. So I am trying right now to work on an app called Maroon Roots, which is essentially trying to digitize those Maroon records. So everyone within the community and those outside that have a desire to learn more about those early Maroon ancestors can actually research those records, and not only research them, but I'm hoping to also connect those back to some of the stories of how these names came about, such as Nanny, such as Shackelford. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of Shackelford. I think I may have seen one on the call right now, but we have someone called the Bread King. In Nigeria, there was someone called the Bread King because literally the bread that they eat every day comes from a Maroon from Charlestown who brought that technology to bake bread in Nigeria, and now this is a type of bread that is enjoyed across West Africa. A Maroon did that. So it's stories like that that I want to be able to connect and be able to celebrate and be able to broadcast within this digital platform. Again, this is just one tool, and I hope that we can empower young Maroon people and other Maroon people across our communities to be able to leverage and create tools just like this. So with that said, this is my last slide. I just wanted to really emphasize that it's important that we connect the past with our present. And I think the way that we do that, we have to do that responsibly. We have to understand what those naming conventions were, what the history was, how that influenced the way that we name today, and how we evolve those names over time. I didn't even talk about the reincarnation aspect of our naming process. Colonel Sterling touched on that yesterday, so for those that weren't there, that was a very powerful component to that. He shared very intimate stories from his own, and I'll share one here as well. So my father, when he was born, he was dying so badly that my grandmother wrapped him in white gauze and cast him aside. However, someone within the community, an elder family member within the community, said that I dreamed an ancestor visited me and told me that your son has the wrong name and he needs to have his name changed to this name. And because the name was changed to this name, my father got better miraculously, and they tried everything, and somehow he got better. So there's also an element that I'm not even talking about here, that there's power in being named in a way that you are actually embodying your ancestors by bearing their name. So we can't forget that. But with that said, family, I just wanted to emphasize that digital technology is upon us. We can't escape it. It's better that we get ahead of it and we use it for our betterment. But at the end of the day, we have to do it in a way that's responsible And if we are able to do that, we will be able to really powerfully tell that story by tracing names, tracing roots, where we can reintegrate our ancestral records with our collective memory story. So with that, I will say Medaase, Medaase, Medaase. There was a question. Can you hear me, Dr. Richard?
Yes, thank you, everybody. That was amazing. I was wondering, what about, are there any people around now, today, who are still using their names as their names? What I read was like in the 1930s or 40s, people were still using academians as their names.
Yes.
You know? But today, Colonel Sterling told me that his grandfather, I think, was called Barpo, which means firstborn. Did you come across today?
Yes, so that's actually one of the things I would love to do as a next step. Again, I was only analyzing those early Maroon ancestral names from like the late 1700s, early 1800s. So that's one of the things that I've been trying to do small. I've been asking and speaking with individuals within the community to actually trace their lineages back to those names. But to your point, yes, we do have people that still very much carry African Day names to this day within the community. And some that may even choose to adopt African Day names. So as you know, Dr. Richards, I have several African names, including an African Day name. So yes, yeah.
Now this is such a great talk and so relevant to the community that you're going to have to give it again. Yeah. But maybe earlier in the day.
Yes, sir.
And maybe at Charlestown again, because you expanded on it now. Yeah.
Yes, more than happy to. And I was just told that there's someone like living right now that has an African Day named Kojo. So yes, it is possible. And yes, and I'm more than happy to present this again. I know everyone is very tired. They've been on the call a very long time, so we're going to wrap up now. But thank you so much, Dr. Richards, for your question.
Yes.
All right. So it was a day filled with information. It was a day that we connected with our ancestors. It's a day that we were empowered, we were enlightened, and we were placed on a journey, tasked to continue what we've learned today and then bring it forward to the next generation. I want to say it was an honor and a pleasure to have had you all here. As always, being on Maroon Roots is sacred. Moortown, home of Granny Nanny. Our visitors, the Maoris, all the Garfunas, all the Tainos, all our indigenous brothers and sisters. It was an honor. A very powerful day. We ended on a very high note. Dr. Osborne, thank you again. That information that you just gave, that trace, oh my God. And please, is your app ready?
No, not yet, because one of the things I want to do is I want to have people within the community continue to test it, to refine it, and I want to collect some of those name-based stories to include. So I will probably be reaching out to you.
Please, I was just going to ask, how do I get access?
Don't worry, I have your contact.
You do? Alright, very good. And that's where it all begins. Because the narrative no longer needs to be in the hands of the other persons. It needs to be in our hands. And that's how we're going to reshape and reclaim what we have lost. I want to say, Medaase, it was an honor and a pleasure.